My name is Ron Moser. I welcome you to this webinar, and in a minute I'm going to start showing our slides. All the attendees are on mute, but we have our panelists here. And the one thing I wanted to mention is if anyone has any questions they'd like to present as they're listening to this webinar, please click on the questions button that's in the GoToWebinar tab close to the bottom. If there's a plus sign next to it, just click on that plus and it'll open up the questions window and you can enter your questions as the webinar proceeds. With that, I'll hand it over to Lee Barrett, the Executive Director of EHNAC. Lee?
Thank you, Ron, and hello everyone. We appreciate your participating in this webinar, which we think will be of very strong interest to all of you, which is really how are you going to prepare and are you ready for an OCR audit. We're going to, we have an excellent panel today that's going to be providing an overview of a lot of the issues that many of you are thinking about as far as what do I do as far as preparing for an OCR audit. And they're going to be going through not only the aspects of what the audit is, but also they're going to be going over their own experiences. We have several people who on the panel who have gone through an OCR audit and are going to be sharing their specific experiences with you as well. So our panelists, Ron, next slide please. So our panelists are the Sharon Klein, who's going to be reviewing the regulatory compliance provisions and impacts. We have Bill O'Byrne from the Regional Extension Center in New Jersey, NJ HITECH, who will be providing a perspective on OCR, which will include a view and emphasis on PHI and data privacy. And then we have Jim Bettendorf from Gateway EDI, who's going to be talking about their OCR audit experience. We will then hear from Doreen Espinoza, and Doreen is going to be talking about the Utah Health Information Network OCR audit experience and some of the lessons learned there. Jonathan Flam from Health Fusion will be talking about their OCR audit experience. And then Ron Moser will be discussing the best practices and lessons learned from a senior auditor from EHNAC's perspective. All of which I think will provide you with a terrific overview and hopefully be able to prepare you as you may potentially either you have gone through an OCR audit or you may be selected to go through an OCR audit in the future. So with that, why don't I go through the biographies from each of the panelists. The first individual, who's Sharon Klein, is a partner at Pepper Hamilton LLP and managing partner of their California office. She has over 30 years of expertise in legal issues relating to health information technology and medical banking and regulatory work relating to healthcare privacy and security and data management. She is an editor of the Privacy and Security Law Journal and frequently speaks about issues in healthcare. She's also a member of both the California and Pennsylvania bars. She's an active member in HIMSS and writes and speaks frequently on issues such as licensing, privacy, security, confidentiality, telemedicine, outcomes, disease management, and managed care. She's also an EHNAC commissioner. She received her undergraduate degree from Syracuse University and her law degree from Temple, where she was also executive director of the Temple Law Review and a member of the Moot Court. Following her graduation from law school, she was a law clerk to the Honorable J. William Ditter, Jr. of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Next is Bill O'Byrne, who is also EHNAC Commissioner, and he is the Executive Director of the NJ HITECH, which is the Regional Extension Center. He was selected, their organization was selected by the Office of the National Coordinator, ONC, to be the, as I said, Regional Extension Center under ARA. NJ HITECH is responsible for assisting New Jersey's medical providers in the transmission from paper records to meaningful use of electronic health information systems. Most recently, Bill was the state coordinator of New Jersey's Office of Development, Implementation, and Deployment. of health information technology. He served as the New Jersey Project Manager for the Health Information Security and Privacy Collaboration, or HITECH, which was a group of 43 states and territories to identify and resolve barriers to interoperable HIE. He founded the New Jersey Adobe and HIPAA HINT Task Force in attention to the smooth transition of the national provider identifiers in the new 5010 and ICD-10 HIPAA transaction and code sets. He also served as Adobe's Manager of Enforcement, Directory, Regulatory Enforcement Investigations, and proceedings against violators, which included insurers, agents, brokers, and public and adjuster violators. He was also the Adobe's liaison for all state and federal HIPAA, privacy, security, and application issues. He's a graduate of Seton Hall University and their School of Law, and began his career in 1970 as a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, serving in Vietnam with the 1st Marine Division. Next, we have Jim Bettendorf, who serves as the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Gateway EDI, where he oversees corporate and HIPAA compliance. He's a certified healthcare compliance officer, and he has over 25 years of experience in the insurance provider and business partner sides of the industry. Next is Doreen Espinoza, who is the Chief Business Development Officer for the Utah Health Information Network. Doreen has over 20 years of experience in the healthcare industry and over 15 years experience in EDI. She's attained degrees from the University of Utah in Accounting and Information Systems Management. She currently works as the Chief Development Officer with Utah, and she actively participates with various national initiatives and committees, which includes the Accredited Standards Committee X12N, the Work Group for Electronic Data Interchange, WEDI, and Health Level 7. And she also serves as co-chair for the WEDI SNP Health Information Exchange HIE Privacy and Security Committee, and is UHIN's Chief Privacy Officer as well. Jonathan Flam has been the Chief Financial Officer of Health Fusion since its inception in 1998. He's also served as President of the National Managed Care Company Western Region from 96 to 98. And prior to that, Jonathan held a variety of executive management roles in managed care, including corporate development, operations, and government programs. He has over 22 years experience in management of healthcare service companies, including a nationally recognized medical transportation organization, and he also serves as an advisor to a variety of healthcare service concerns. He received his MBA from Fordham in '91 and also received a BS in economics from the State University of New York in '87. He resides in San Diego with his wife and 2 daughters, where his wife is also involved in a variety of community activities there. And finally, we have Ron Moser as our panelist, and Ron has over 25 years of professional experience in healthcare IT. He's the Managing Director of Moser Haas Consulting. He provides guidance to organizations committed to improving their operations through the implementation of effective risk-based IT controls. He specializes in the areas of healthcare IT and accreditation through EHNAC, and has led multiple companies through their preparation for EHNAC accreditation. In addition to direct consultative work with these organizations, he's a senior consultant and a site reviewer for EHNAC, and in his role as a consultant, he provides leadership in the development of new EHNAC programs and development of industry white papers. In his role as a site reviewer, he's performed audits for many companies, various types and sizes, for over 7 years. And he has extensive HIPAA and HITECH experience with detailed knowledge of all the EHNAC programs. Prior to forming his own company, Ron was Director for Clearinghouse Operations for NDC Health, which is now part of Relay Health, which he joined in '87 as the Chief Architect for one of the nation's first healthcare transaction networks. He led the IT team to ensure its healthcare network commanded really a leadership position throughout its history. So those are our panelists. And so, Ron, let's go on to the next slide, please. So what we're going to go over as far as the webinar today are several objectives. First, we want to review with you the risk of an OCR audit and how really our primary goal for this is to really review with you the OCR process, what people have gone through, give you some experiences, as well as to provide you with hopefully some best practices that you can use to prepare for an OCR audit should you be selected in the future. We're going to also be talking about some of the latest healthcare reform impacts about HIPAA, ERA, HITECH, as well as the Affordable Care Act. So Sharon is going to be providing a very good overview there for you. And then we're going to be talking about some of the case studies that several of our panelists have in fact gone through OCR audits, so they're going to be sharing their experiences with you. We're going to also talk about, and you can give some thought to, your overall organizational risk tolerance and for implementing some of the strategies for addressing risk mitigation and what you can do to mitigate some of that risk of an OCR audit and avoid some of the penalties, as well as being listed on the wall of shame, as they call it at this point. Next slide. Okay, so some of the challenges that we're also going to be discussing talk about the role of OCR and HIPAA enforcement, keeping current really with healthcare reform and the various both at the national level as well as at the regional level, at state level, and continuing to monitor that. We're going to talk about stakeholder trust, the risk aspects of managing risk and mitigation that I previously mentioned, and along with how that goes along with privacy and security issues. So with that, next slide. So we're going to turn this over to Sharon Klein, who will take us through some of the regulatory compliance provisions and impacts, and provide some of an overview as well of OCR and what OCR is doing. And thanks to I think Linda Sanchez for some of the slides that I think Sharon's going to be referencing as well. Sharon.
Thank you, Lee. By way of background and setting the stage, next slide, please, Ron. This all began with HIPAA, which was enacted in 1996 and attempted to balance the cost effectiveness of having claims and remittances electronically with ensuring the trust of the electronic health record through privacy and security rules. And there are three classes of covered entities under HIPAA: payers, providers, and clearinghouses. And business associates, or third parties that act on behalf of a covered entity, were covered under HIPAA through a business associate agreement. The privacy and security rules were key to protecting protected health information, or PHI, which was individually identifiable health information which could be traced back to a unique patient. Next slide. In 2009, the government enacted HITECH and also started the stimulus program where it allocated about $20 billion for the adoption of electronic health records to certainly reduce costs, but also provide interoperability and connectivity across the continuum of healthcare. There are many changes that HITECH made to HIPAA. It enacted direct accountability for noncompliance to those business associates that I mentioned, and also established breach requirements for noncompliance, which was not in the HIPAA original legislation. Overall, there was a renewed emphasis on privacy and security rules, and enforcement was strengthened in many levels. New penalties were established for things called willful neglect. As Lee mentioned, there is a wall of shame which allowed reporting to a website that HHS monitored of breaches. And there's a mandate that compliance would be assured through the performance of privacy and security audits, and OCR has increased fines for noncompliance, and the penalties and fines that were assessed go back in to fund more enforcement. Some of the audits were conducted by KPMG and then also by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I believe there are about 115 audits that were done in 2012. Next slide. The OCR audits are the topic of our conversation today, and as Lee said, much of what I'll be discussing in the next several slides came from the sort of year-end 2012 audit review of the protocols and pilot programs that were established through OCR and KPMG. And these slides were presented by Linda Sanchez, who obviously headed that program and was the senior advisor at OCR. So the design of the program was really to develop trends and analyses to assure compliance, assessing policies and practices and operations in a comprehensive way, and auditing those with GAO standards to figure out best risks and also vulnerability, best practices, and also vulnerabilities and risks that the market had in terms of noncompliance with privacy and security. Next slide. So who are the folks that were audited? Well, in 2012, it was really a focus on covered entities of all sizes, shapes, locations, whether they were public or private, whether they were small, medium, or large, clearinghouses, providers, payers, and business associates were really sort of left to the next wave. Next slide. And for the program, and we have several folks that have gone through these audits on our program today, they received a notification letter and asked to provide documentation, then most often had a site visit, and then KPMG would come in and audit and suggest modifications, and then summarize findings of all of the audits up to OCR and issue a final report on a debrief on trends and findings and what actions the covered entities were taking to get to best practices and to mitigate the risk of noncompliance. Next slide. So the concept of the audits are really an improvement tool that through corrective action on the part of covered entities could result in increased compliance for privacy and security, which really was a framework of trust that would enable the electronic health record to be a reality for everyone by 2014. And if the audit did uncover very serious compliance issues, or frankly, no effort at all of compliance, that could lead to a separate investigation, if you will, by OCR. But the original audit by KPMG were intended to be improvement tools against trends and best practices with suggestions and corrective actions required on the part of the entity. Next slide. So you're looking at performance audits with benchmarks, right? The ultimate benchmark would be the privacy, security, and breach rules that first came out of HIPAA and then were increased in HITECH and conducted under generally acceptable government auditing standards to issue an opinion about whether the entity has controls in place to assure compliance with those privacy, security, and breach rules, and how are they going to maintain that compliance over time. So the idea was not to ramp up fines and penalties, but rather to increase the level of compliance with the privacy, security, and breach regulations in HIPAA and HITECH. Next slide, please. So the high interest areas that became the focus, if you will, of those audits were uses and disclosures, and all these are regulations under HIPAA and HITECH. And uses and disclosures is very, very broad and talks about protecting PHI at every level, whether it's use, storage, transfer, or disposal. Especially looking at onward transfer, if you will, transfer beyond the covered entities to business associates. And interestingly enough, under HITECH, of course, the business associates now had direct liability for noncompliance, regardless of whether they had signed up in a business associate agreement. And looking at those uses and disclosures was key to all of the audits. For covered entities, they are required to have a notice of privacy practices, and the audit would see if, in fact, they did have a notice, whether all provisions that were mandated under the regs were covered, and whether that notice was paper, electronic, or otherwise. And then focus on the patient. There are several areas of patients' rights in HIPAA HITECH. Those rights of access and denial of access were also scrutinized and monitored by the auditors. And clearly, breach notification requirements and process. Under HITECH, there are very, very specific notification rules describing the content of the notice, to whom notice should be sent, the concept of the wall of shame, etc., and the response and mitigation that is necessary for breach. And finally, administrative, technical, and physical security requirements, of course, were of interest. Administrative requirements such as doing a risk assessment, having awareness and training of your employees and suppliers and other vendors and third parties, planning for privacy and security, the concept of privacy by design, and clearly making sure that you had documentation of what you were doing in terms of building privacy and security compliance. For physical security, looking at firewalls, encryptions, whether there are security incidents, access control, and technical security, looking at authentication, integrity of passwords, monitoring of situations and follow-up. So those were the things of extreme focus, if you will. Next slide. And the findings that resulted ultimately from those audits were that policies and procedures, if they were implemented at all, were really not updated. So folks under 1996 HIPAA language would have certain policies and procedures, but maybe not even have them updated for HITECH, which would be a very, very large gap analysis. The finding also was that really HITECH compliance wasn't at the top of everybody's list. Perhaps it was underfunded because there's so much going on in meaningful use, but clearly that compliance was not high priority. There's a lack of regular risk assessments, especially of third parties, and those third parties statistically have been proven to be the source of greatest concern in terms of breach of PHI. And there really wasn't a target entity, if you will, that had those non-compliance issues discovered. It was widely dispersed amongst small entities and large entities of every stripe. And so, I think the message from the preliminary findings is that everyone has to do better. And, OCR was attempting through the audit to give us some guidelines about what we all needed to think through and do for compliance with HIPAA and HITECH. Next slide. Just a note that if we did not comply as an entity, the repercussions could be very severe. There are civil and criminal penalties under HITECH with various tiering. As I mentioned, they introduced a new category of willful neglect, which means you really knew what you should be doing, but just turned a blind eye and failed to do it. Those civil penalties could be up to $50,000 per violation with an annual aggregate of $1.5 million, and criminal penalties additionally of $250,000 with 10-year imprisonment. And not only is there the ability to do governmental, civil, and criminal penalties, but also enforcement by states' attorneys general, which have authority to bring civil actions on behalf of their residents, and also private class actions were being brought not only under federal law but state law, and those class actions could result in multi-million-dollar exposures for various entities. Some examples in the next slide, please, Ron. Signet Health, in which there is an assessment of $4.3 million for various HIPAA violations. And in that case, it was a denial of 41 patients' access to medical records. So it was dealing with that aspect of HIPAA HITECH. But also, there are some additional dollars that were assessed because of non-cooperation, frankly, by the entity in the audit and in the compliance investigation. Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary had, a theft of laptops, which is relatively common, I hate to say, but it had a lot of patient records on it, and they failed to adopt policies and procedures. So again, failure to do administrative, technical, and physical security resulted in $1.5 million fine. And then there are a multitude of fines and penalties for breach of PHI. I just put one up here, which is CVS, where they were fined $2.25 million because they failed to properly dispose of labels containing PHI. But that list could go on, and if you look at the wall of shame, there are breach fines for not only covered entities but also business associates. Next slide. So what are the takeaways here for organizations? Well, first, you really need to understand your compliance status, whether you're a business associate or a covered entity, and develop the appropriate policies and procedures to ensure compliance with the use and disclosure of PHI. One of the very basic things you need to do is discover where PHI is hiding with your organization and how it flows through to third parties, and establish those administrative, technical, and physical security safeguards that have been required by HIPAA HITECH and are now being enforced through the audit procedures. Have an interdisciplinary group on data breaches. Have not only the CIO but also the CFO, the folks that are doing risk assessment, your attorneys, and someone that does employee and PR effective announcements, if you will, and communications. And finally, conduct assessments and reassessments. Do an annual reassessment of compliance. Because if you don't, you could have those criminal and civil investigations, not only federal penalties but also state, and public harm and reputational risk on the wall of shame, in addition to legal and consulting costs of remediating the noncompliance and dealing with the breach notifications and also the notifications to media and the regulatory bodies. So Lee, hopefully that sets the stage for our next speakers that can go through their experiences with the audit process.
Sharon, that was a great overview. I think going through, some of both at the federal level as well as some of the aspects even at the regional level, what we're able to find is some of the implications between all the various legislation and how we're aligning. And I know OCR is clearly aligning with that of HIPAA, and we've got a lot of those regs that really is what the OCR audits are focused on. So,
if I could add, since we have a minute,
sure.
I think there is a lot of sort of interagency cooperation, not only on the OCR side, but also across the federal regulatory schemes, such as where FTC is certainly aligned on the consumer protection side and data protection side with the patient rights, if you will, that were a fundamental baseline for both HIPAA and HITECH.
Yeah, no, very good. That's very excellent. So we're going to have Bill going through kind of the Regional Extension Center perspective on OCR, and he's got a number of views, especially focusing on the aspects of PHI and data privacy. So Bill, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lee. Before I commence the slides, however, I wanted to tell you about something I read about just yesterday, and it was too late to get into these slides. It appears that there are overwhelming numbers of doctors who are now starting to use the social media not only to access health information, but also to exchange health information with fellow doctors. These may be only provider-only websites, but nonetheless, there's no saying whether they have any of a modicum of privacy and security compliance, and that just heightens the the burden and the problem that we all sense is coming our way from privacy and security compliance. By way of history, we can go to the first slide, please. By way of history, you probably already have heard from Sharon that there are a myriad of different agencies and entities that can call you to account for violations of privacy and security. The obvious one is the Office of Civil Rights, but the state attorney generals have authority, CDC has authority. I myself was part of the Department of Insurance in the state where I am for many, many years, and I can tell you I was in charge of the Regulatory Enforcement Unit, and it was part of my responsibility to take action when there was violation of privacy and security issues by insurance companies. And we regularly did that. People would come to us from various sources complaining that the insurance company had, whether intentionally or less intentionally or even by accident, violated their privacy and security rights, and remedial action had to be taken immediately. We took great and urgent effort on the part of the Department of Insurance to rectify that problem immediately so that the consumer was restored to a sense of privacy and security that they're entitled to. There would also be substantial fines and penalties that would be leveled on a state level. And in many instances, these matters also resulted in jurisdictional issues, but we always had co-jurisdiction with federal agencies, and we considered that we would take on the entities in New Jersey just as well as turn them over to the federal entities as well. So if you could go to the next slide. There are really two kinds of violations that I would encounter. One were the obvious violations where there was a complete disregard for the fundamental obligations imposed by regulations and laws. As a regional extension center, I should tell you right now that we are experiencing overt violations in doctors' offices. Without naming names, all I can tell you is that we regularly go into doctors' offices and find violations that could warrant substantial fines and penalties. Of course, I'm not in the regulatory enforcement business now, so what we do is help the doctors to take remedial action. And in fact, we have a privacy and security tool that we share with the doctors, we give to them, and it walks them through the first stage of meaningful use, which you're probably aware of. It does require an assessment and a remediation plan to be compliant with meaningful use in the first stage. So we consider it our responsibility to be very aware of provider responsibilities in privacy and security and take immediate action to rectify any that we find. I should also point out that when it comes to meaningful use 2, the bar gets a little bit higher, and I should also say that in year 2 of meaningful use 1, there is a requirement that the providers start taking meaningful steps to implement the changes and the problems that they found in their remediation plan. So we're going back in the second year of meaningful use stage 1 now and seeing whether or not the doctors have in fact implemented the remedial actions that we have been counseling. If they haven't, then we put them on the right track to endeavor to do that. There are technical violations that we also encounter. These are the non-serious, well, they could be indeed serious, but they are more technical in nature, and we can act immediately to cure those problems. Next slide, please. Now, what we've seen, and in my career I've seen these matters come to the forefront in two different ways. One is whistleblowers come out. It's becoming more and more obvious to people who are in businesses and their employees in businesses, large and small, that being a whistleblower for overt or just technical violations is a way that a disgruntled employee can have a meaningful impact on an employer that has been less than generous or kind. I would want to remind you all that we all face that exposure, and it's important that we guard against any opportunity for those that would do us harm as employers to make sure that we follow all the rules assiduously. It's also obvious that people do these things for personal gain. Once again, in my career, I saw many opportunities when people just took upon themselves the personal gain angle of having personal health records or private and secure information, and they would intentionally sell it, and those people warrant substantial and punitive action. Next slide, please. Now, the remedial plan that I talked about a minute ago can come up either through a study of where the problems are through a privacy and security tool, or alternately, we routinely, when I was in enforcement, would order remediation efforts. And in fact, these remediation efforts, in many cases, were much more costly and time-consuming than the fine and penalty. I recall one instance in which it was clear that Social Security numbers were sent out by a health insurer, but the addresses on the envelopes weren't for the right people. Consequently, there was a distribution of Social Security numbers to people that they didn't belong to. The insurance company spent thousands and thousands of dollars to try to rectify that by way of privacy and security safeguards that they had to put in place for a year or two on people's credit history and different other things that might be abused. So the cost of resolving this is not just what you might be fined or penalized or even appearing on the wall of shame. The cost of remediation in many cases is the big factor that lots of people don't want to even consider. Next slide, please. And meaningful use protected health information. I won't read this to you, but you can see that that is the steps and measures that we put in place by way of our assistance to the doctors that we represent. We have nearly 7,000 doctors in New Jersey, and we like to think that we give them a lot of service, particularly in terms of privacy and security, with a free, no-cost tool that will steer them in the right direction. And I think that's the end of my presentation, Lee.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Really good overall perspective on not only from certainly the Regional Extension Center, what you're doing at NJ HITECH, but also from an industry perspective and some of the experiences that that you have seen. So thanks, Bill. So our next presenter is Jim Bettendorf of Gateway EDI, and Jim's going to be talking about some of the experiences that they've had in going through an OCR audit and some of the lessons learned that they have. Jim, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lee. And as you said, I'm with Gateway EDI, and we are a healthcare clearinghouse, and we had the pleasure of being audited this past July by KPMG. Next slide, Ron. And as we previously heard from Sharon, HIPAA mandates the protection of health information from unauthorized use and disclosure of PHI, and then OCR has the responsibility for administering and enforcing the privacy and security rules, as well as the breach notification rule. And HITECH Act requires HHS to perform periodic audits of covered entities and business associates with respect to the compliance with these rules. Now, currently, KPMG has been engaged by OCR to conduct the performance audits of covered entities. And to this end, the purpose of the OCR audits is to present an opportunity to examine mechanisms for compliance, identify best practices among covered entities and business associates, discover risks and vulnerabilities, share best practices gleaned through the audit process with the industry, and provide guidance targeted to observe compliance challenges. Next slide. From the engagement letter we received from HHS, the OCR performance audit objectives for KPMG are twofold. First, to analyze the key processes, controls, or policies relative to selected requirements of the privacy, security, and breach notification rules as specified in an audit protocol established by the OCR, and then two, to provide their observations back to OCR. Next slide. So with that, we have the OCR audit process. First of all is receiving the notice from the Department of Health and Human Services that you've been selected. And this notification consists of a request for all documentation regarding to privacy, security, and breach notification rules, and then to include also the dates on which the on-site field work will be included. This includes meeting key members of organization responsible for the implementation of the organization strategy and operations relative to the adoption of the privacy, security, and breach notification rules. Through a variety of inquiry, observation, and review procedures, KPMG will collect both verbal and documented information. And then at the exit interview, the initial findings will be provided. Then the KPMG process follows, send their findings to their quality assurance group for review and for the potential of additional findings and observations that will require a management response. Next is the notice of findings and recommendations. And then this information is sent back to the entity for a representation letter from executive management to support KPMG in their ability to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence to provide a reasonable basis for their final report. The final report is then submitted to OCR by KPMG along with the notice of findings and recommendations and representation letter. So on the next slide, some of the observations that we had while taking part in this process include the request for information. We reviewed and discussed this request and worked lockstep with our legal department to ensure that we were in compliance with all the requested documentation that KPMG was looking for. And basically what we did is we inundated KPMG with documentation up to and including all of our HIPAA policies and procedures, employee lists with system active accounts, organizational chart, disaster recovery plan, business continuity plan, our most recent EHNAC site visit report from March of 2012, our SSA E16 report from 2011, our most recent security site assessment, training documentation, movie, business associate agreements, etc. And then while KPMG was out for field work, we wanted to show them how much the compliance with the regulations and the rules meant. So we made sure that they met with our entire executive team, executive and legal teams at the opening meeting. And from then on, the process was managed by myself and our security officer. We met with the KPMG auditors every morning, and then usually as they needed us or at the end of the day. KPMG generally would forward, the auditors would generally forward requests via email to us. And then at our exit interview, we concluded with the same executive and legal team as we had at the initial. So on staff, we had 5 auditors. Back in July, this was only their second or third audit, so I would classify them as being fairly green in regard to the process. You can see we went from an exit briefing with for our notice of findings and recommendations. We had 4 findings and 5 observations to the time when the final report was sent to OCR. Through the appeal process, we were able to reduce that to 1 finding and 2 observations. So one of my recommendations is don't be afraid to appeal. We found that the KPMG auditor's strength was in their knowledge of security systems, but we also noticed they were very black and white, going from the government-provided script. And being a healthcare clearinghouse, this made it a little bit more challenging for us, as they weren't as familiar with us or our type of covered entity in this process. They were more familiar with healthcare providers and health plans. So we found ourselves having to educate them quite a bit on how data flows in and out of our systems. Next slide. So finally, the lessons learned kind of reiterate what we've previously heard about documenting and keeping your compliance programs current. Upon conclusion of the exit conference with KPMG, the auditors noted they were very impressed with our organization. They stated our supporting documentation was one of the most robust and best they had ever seen. In addition, their lead auditor had indicated we'd receive a gold star and be highlighted in their report to OCR as a leading practice for the extra efforts we go through to be in compliance, specifically citing our EHNAC accreditation, SSAE 16 accreditation, the annual security risk assessments, etc. And then finally, many of our associates had to assist with the need for additional documentation or interviews with the auditors. Their speed and thoroughness of their responses left a positive mark on these auditors as well, and really reflected how we've adopted a culture of compliance within our organization. So with that, I have completed mine, and I will pass it back to you, Lee.
Jim, excellent. Thank you very much for sharing Gateway's experience, what you've gone through. I mean, it was a great overview, Jim, and sounds like things went extremely well. So appreciate your sharing some of your thoughts with the audience here. So our next presenter is Doreen Espinoza from the Utah Health Information Network, and Doreen's going to, again, share with you some of the experiences that UHIN has gone through as part of their OCR audit, and some of the lessons learned that they have as well come up with that we'll be sharing with you. So Doreen, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for those of you that are participating, and good afternoon. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do is start out, first of all, by looking at the Office of Civil Rights timeline. Now, this slide was actually received from OCR, and so I just wanted to show you kind of how things progress, and you've already been told a little bit about each of these things. What I'd like to do is just give you our experience, and it says there's 1 business day for notification letter to be sent to covered entities. Well, we got our letter on May 24th, and it was dated April 24th. So it was just a little off from the get-go. At that particular point in time, within the body of the letter, it asks for documentation to be sent within 15 business days. Well, as Ron will hopefully attest later on, I was right in the middle of an EHNAC self-assessment. So for me to take on the OCR audit as well as finish up our assessment was absolutely impossible. The one thing I do have to say is the OCR auditors were very gracious, and they worked with me so that I was able to get my documentation in later on. And so they really did work with us. They're not, they're not ogres. They're people like you and me, and they will work with you if you have extenuating circumstances. Now, once we submitted our information, it was about a month later that we had a conversation, and we talked about some dates for them to come visit us. Interestingly enough, they did come out the week after we finished up with our EHNAC audit, which is actually good and bad. I mean, I was pretty much done with audits, but it was all still fresh in my mind, so that helped us out. And they were, in fact, in our office for about 3 days, and they came in at around 8, and they left around 5 or 5:30. So they did work very hard and were very interested in what we were doing and put us through our cases during the audit itself. Now, after the audit, we did have an out briefing, and at that particular point in time, we had no findings, which was actually wahoo for you, and since that time, the auditors have completed their work and have sent that audit report on to OCR. At this point in time, we are in fact still waiting for our final audit report. So we kind of skipped the covered entity provides management responses. So we didn't have to do that part, which was thankfully for us, something we got to skip out of. But from what I understand, the last conversation that I had with OCR and the auditors, we should be receiving our final report at the end of this month. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that you get with your letter are 2 attachments. You get attachment A and attachment B. I just wanted to go over attachment B first because it's the one that's the easiest one and for you to complete as you receive your information. Attachment E is basic information about your organization. This is where you get to select what kind of entity you are, what kind of things you're doing. Next slide, please. So there's one page that is for everybody, and then there are 3 additional pages that will show. There's one for healthcare providers, and for the healthcare providers, you have a total of 6 questions or 6 boxes you need to fill out. And then there's also a page that you have for health plans. So if you're a health plan, you have 4 questions. And then if you are, in fact, a clearinghouse, which is what UHIN was audited as, there's 4 questions for the clearinghouse. So you get to pick what kind of an entity you are, and then you get to answer some basic information. Now, the next slide, please. The next page that you get is attachment A. And what I want to say about this is when you get it, it's like 2.5 pages, 3 pages long. It's very deceiving because you're looking at something going, oh, yeah, I think I can do that. But then you dig deep into it, and the way that it's split out is you have some general questions, you have a security section, and within that security section, you have administrative, physical, and technical responses that you have to answer to. And then there's a privacy section, which talks about or asks for information on your policies and procedures. Next slide, please. This is the documentation from attachment A. These are all of the large headings. Don't let it fool you, because each and every one of these things could mean that you have 1 or 20 documents attached to each one of these lines. What I've done is I've highlighted just a few of the items that I believe were the most important to you in going through our audit. Before we went through our audit, just after I got our letter, I went out to the OCR website and found out, well, what are people having problems with? What are some of the obstacles? And what I found are these basic documents or this documentation that I wanted to pay special attention to, because these were the areas that people have the most problem with. When you begin to think about a risk assessment, a lot of people don't even know what that means, and so they just weren't being done. Now, UHIN has always had a risk assessment. Thanks to our EHNAC accreditation, we've always had to have one, so it was something that I was able to provide to our auditors. Now, the assessment includes EPHI, or electronic, but I also included with that assessment anything that was on paper, because we have some paper in our office. in addition to that, you have the risk assessment procedure. So not only do you have to know what risk you have, but then you have to have procedures that says, how do I get to my assessment? And also you have to have policy. This is very, very critical. So for those of you that are thinking about what's going to happen, I would like you to pay special attention to these things because they are really important, and the auditors were very interested in this. Now, in addition to those pieces or those documentation, there's also the security incident management. And that includes your disaster recovery, your exercise documentation of disaster, and your backup and recovery plan. And I don't know how many of you know this, but in Utah, our state Medicaid had a very severe breach with over 600,000 identities that were actually stolen from our Medicaid program. So part of what happened when we had our audit is the auditors were very interested in knowing how we fit into that. And what we found when we were notified that Medicaid had had their breach, we actually went through any of our connections with the Medicaid program to make sure none of that data had come through UHIN and that all of the UHIN files were safe. And what we found is that UHIN had done a very good job, but we did actually have to provide the incident report that we developed at the time of the breach. So that was something that you never really want to test your plan, but at least not in real life. But I would recommend that everyone do their test plans and also run it through an exercise so you learn to see what you did that worked and what you needed to change. And we had that in a very real life situation. Fortunately for us, all of our processes worked and nothing was obtained through UHIN. Now, that's for your security. As you move into your privacy, what you want to have shored up are your privacy practices. And we sent a laundry list of documents to OCR for them to review regarding our practices. This is something that you have to keep up to date. You can't just write it once and hope everybody follows it. You do have to do your training. You do have to do your updates. And you want to do this as a minimum on an annual basis. In addition to the privacy practices, OCR was very interested in uses and disclosures. And you've already heard that. I'll give you my own little story. I sat in an office with 5 auditors for 2.5 hours talking about disclosures, which is really interesting because UHIN doesn't disclose data as a clearinghouse. So it was a very interesting conversation with me kind of repeating myself over and over, but I have the same answer: we don't disclose data. And so, you don't have to try and come up with the answer. You have to give the answer of what you're really doing when you're going through the audit. Next slide, please. In the end, our response included 72 documents that were sent out before the audit. Critical to those response documents was the EHNAC self-assessment, our risk analysis, and this was just the executive summary, and then our disaster recovery. Those 3 documents were, I feel, very important in explaining what we do, what our risk is, and how we can overcome any problem that might happen. Once the auditors got on site, we provided them with 55 additional documents, and there's that incident management report that I was telling you about, and our electronic commerce agreement. UHIN is unique in that we don't have business associate agreements with everybody. We have an electronic commerce agreement that was developed by the legal committee, which consists of all of our major payers and providers in the state of Utah. They volunteered their attorneys to help us create this electronic commerce agreement. So we have one for every entity that is a trading partner on our system. We did have to provide the full risk analysis, so this was the entire analysis from which I derived our summary. They were very interested in that. And then also our breach process. Now, fortunately for us, we did not have to enact a breach process because we didn't have a breach, but it did show that not only did we have an incident management report, but we also had a breach process in the event anything like that happens to us. Next slide, please. Again, you can have no findings or observations from the audit, and we are waiting to get that final report back. Next slide, please. What I can tell you about what happened with OCR, the OCR audit in UHIN, is this is not something you do at the spur of the moment. This is not something that is done once you get the letter. You need to continue to push forward your privacy, security, policies and procedures, and make sure that you're compliant with all your HITECH provisions. So this is not a one-time thing. If you haven't prepared, trying to get that stuff done during the time frame of the audit, it's not going to happen. You really do need to understand that this is an ongoing process for you and your organization. As was mentioned before, the auditors are fairly new. This is a new process for them as it is for us. You may have to spend some time educating your auditors on your particular entity. You know your business best, and you know, they're reasonable people. You just need to work with them to understand what you do and how you implement the privacy and security rules. You need to be able to discuss why you implemented something a certain way and how HITECH pertains to you. The one thing that I was kind of bummed about when I was talking with the OCR folks is that I said, well, geez, is this like jury duty once I get audited? I don't ever have to do this again, or it will be a number of years? And they said, no, you can be audited again and again. So that takes us right back to our first bullet, and that is, this is not a one-time activity. One of the things I can tell you also that really helped us, and I've mentioned it a couple of times already, is that EHNAC was absolutely critical to our success in that the accreditation process keeps it all fresh in our minds. It all keeps us heading towards the goal of compliance. So if you have an opportunity, I'm probably not supposed to say this, but I'm going to anyway. If you have an opportunity to be to participate in EHNAC, please do. It's well worth your time and effort. And that is the end of my slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. That was terrific. That was great. What a great overview of the process, what you went through, your experiences, and some of the lessons learned. I really liked as well your point on the test planning. Even though you have, I think one of the emphasizing is once you have a test plan, even though you may not ever have to exercise it or go through it, what you want to do is to go through and go through the various exercises on an annual basis or even quarterly or semi-annual and take some of the lessons learned out of that and bring that back into your how you refine your plan going forward. So very good. Thank you very much. So the next presenter is Jonathan Flam from Health Fusion, and John's going to talk about, again, their experience in going through an OCR audit and lessons learned that they came up with as well from their experience. John?
Thanks, Lee. If you could just go to the next slide. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I think, what the previous speakers had said. I felt like we had a sufficient amount of time to prepare. However, when we got the letter from OCR was dated more than a few weeks prior to when we actually received it. But once we spoke to our contact at KPMG and the OCR, they were really, I think, helpful and reassuring that the timing wouldn't be an issue. So I felt like we had more than enough time to prepare. And of course, a lot of the documentation that we had prepared for our EHNAC site review and review annually for our EHNAC site review were the same documents that we submitted as part of our OCA audit. The next part I'll talk about a little bit is the on-site activities, and then just like everybody else, the lessons learned and maybe some of the takeaways. The one recommendation I would make is my experience is that there was a lot of time spent on the HIPAA risk analysis and the process for reviewing policies and procedures on an annual basis. It was a good review. I also felt like in preparing for it, a couple of things you should know about our company. Maybe I take a step back. I think of all the organizations that went through the OCR audit that's on this webinar, we probably are one of the smaller ones. Our scale isn't that large. I'm currently the CFO, Security Officer, and Privacy Officer. We have now we have about 80 employees, but when we first got EHNAC accredited, we probably had about 25. And the first time we went through our EHNAC site review, it was actually a difficult process to go through. But it was probably the best thing we ever did, both in terms of getting our organization prepared for these OCR audits, but also, preparing us to have the best possible security and privacy. And I think we've benefited from the EHNAC process because we've developed a lot of really good practices, policies, and procedures. So I thought we were well prepared for the OCR audit because of our EHNAC experience. Next slide, please. When they came on site, our group had never done an OCR audit before. They were all new. My observation would be that the OCR team had a different base of experience than our EHNAC site reviewers. The focus they had in terms of expertise, the lead person was a forensic accountant. There was a consultant from Washington, D.C. that really had an expertise in regulatory it looked like regulatory issues. There was a junior person, and that was the 3 people on site. There was a 4th person available by phone to help with some of the technical questions like encryption and things like that. They probably spent 4 days here, all 3 of them, or 3.5 full days. I'd say 3 full days and half a day. A lot of the time they spent was alone just reviewing papers and paperwork. I did spend about, I'd say, 2 to 3 hours a day with them discussing questions that they had after reviewing our policies and procedures. They spent time at our data center, and they spent a small amount of time looking at some reports, technical reports. But the primary focus of their visit was really to review our implementation of our policies and procedures that are there to comply with HIPAA. The one other thing that I thought worth mentioning is that the document requests and many of the documents that they were reviewing are covered under FOIA, and they were really helpful in making sure that we didn't disclose anything that we didn't want disclosed in a final report. So I was unaware of that prior to the OCR audit, that a lot of what you're going to submit to them potentially could be made available under the Freedom of Information Act. And if there's anything proprietary or that you consider a trade secret, you might be careful about how you submit that, so that and they were helpful to me in making sure that I didn't reveal anything I wouldn't want on the internet available to the entire public. So next slide, please. One of the things, I think they had one finding, and it was around incident reporting. And I think there's always a lesson to be learned. I think I learned from every single site review. I do our financial audits. I learned from those. And the one thing I learned is that incident reporting is actually a more complete process. I think historically we've always done incident reporting. We report the incident, we document it, we review it. But really what they forced me to do is to review the incident and create a new practice or procedure so that the incident doesn't reoccur. I know that seems obvious, but we weren't doing that before. And we do it now, so I feel like we've benefited from that aspect of the review. And they did spend a fair amount of time reviewing any security incidents. That's probably the only time I remember them actually interviewing any of our employees, just to review how the reporting was done and what was done after the incident itself. And I know that when I met with them, they wanted to make sure that our organization had a plan for incident reporting under the HITECH Act, and making sure that I personally, as the security officer, understood all our requirements. So again, that was an area that, yeah, we were really well prepared for that. Our employees are well trained, and a lot of that was prompted because we've done those things to comply with HIPAA, and also our EHNAC site review kind of reinforced that those are requirements that we need to make sure we meet. Yeah, we did take them down to our data center. My observation was that that part of the review, the technical performance and looking at the actual technical safeguards and even the data center itself, the physical safeguards there, they were not experts at that, but they were impressed, and I think they got the gist of it. I think that's it. Next slide, please. So my takeaway was the emphasis was on the organization's HIPAA awareness. I really believe that annual training and training of management, for a company like ours, which is, we probably have a management team of about 6, maybe 75 employees, it's really, really imperative that training be done annually, but it's also important that training be meaningful, that everybody really, truly understands what their roles are as it relates to handling PHI, that they don't just go through a class and sign off that they took it, but they actually have that understanding. Because here they'll talk to any and every employee because we don't have that many. So I felt really good about that. Our employees were well trained. They spoke to about 2 or 3 of them, and all of them, I think, impressed upon the auditors that they've been trained and they understand what their roles are as it relates to HIPAA. And I think that's an important aspect, especially if you're an organization of a smaller scale where they can actually sit down with some of your employees like they did with us. Incident reporting was probably, when they were meeting with our employees, that was probably the main thing they were looking at, making sure people understood what their requirements were under HITECH to report incidents. I think I mentioned the other piece, which is really taking advantage of the incidents that do occur, the inadvertent disclosures, the small things that give us a chance to review our practices to make sure that we don't have the same mistake reoccurring. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I told this to the folks at EHNAC. I felt that our being accredited by EHNAC since 2006 was excellent preparation for the OCR audit. Going all the way back to the beginning, our first EHNAC site review really forced us to put in place a lot of infrastructure that both benefited the company but also helped us comply with HIPAA and the state regulations. We did have to submit over to them on site our 2010 EHNAC site review, which was, for us it was a positive document. They did review it. I think that it was helpful to them to see what EHNAC was looking at, because our particular audit team was unfamiliar with EHNAC and what the site review process was. So I think showing them that document and showing them some of the things that we went through for EHNAC, I think gave us, as an organization, a lot of credibility. The only other thing I would say is if you are currently an EHNAC accredited organization, you'll find that the OCR audit had a narrower scope. I don't think it's as a broad a review of the company. There is more emphasis, or it's a narrowly focused on the regulatory compliance aspects, which are covered under EHNAC, but that's probably where, if you were an EHNAC organization about to get reviewed by OCR or their auditors, you probably need to make sure those aspects of your company's both documentation and operations are in place. I guess that's it. I felt, the only closing comment, I felt really grateful that as probably the person that does 90% of the activity for EHNAC and for the OCR audit, I felt really grateful that we had been part of the EHNAC process, because it was excellent preparation, and it also, I think, gave our company, and gives our company, whether it's with auditors or just in general, a lot more credibility as it relates to our HIPAA compliance. And that's my presentation. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Great overview of your experiences and some of the lessons learned that you went through as well as an organization. Really appreciate your thoughts there. So next we're going to turn to, as our final panelist, is Ron Moser. And I think, as many of you are aware, as we've mentioned on this call, Ron is a senior site reviewer for EHNAC. He's also been very involved with development of a lot of our criteria, working with us as well. He's been doing this for well over 7 years, as well as his experiences prior to that. So with that, Ron, we're going to turn it over to you to kind of put in perspective a lot of what our previous panelists have talked about, as well as what you gained out of being and managing our site review process as well.
Okay, thank you, Lee. And I'll keep this pretty short. I want to leave some time for questions as well. First, I'd like to emphasize I am an auditor. I'm obviously not an OCR auditor, but an EHNAC auditor. But I think there are some things that I've seen both through being an EHNAC auditor and seeing, communicating with some of the organizations that have gone through OCR audits. Just a few things here that I'll mention to keep in mind. Kind of under what I've labeled here best practices, I think what's very key is that you do have a thorough risk assessment, which has been brought up many times through the other panelists. You need to make sure you've taken a look at your systems, your services, your people, your business, and it's a good practice for your business in general anyway to take a look at various aspects and say, where are my risks? Where are my exposures? And what controls do I have in place to mitigate those risks? And what kind of residual risk remains so that you're aware of it, so that you know it well? And particularly in working with healthcare and particularly with the OCR audits, you want to make sure that it's very PHI focused. You want to know where your exposures are, and you want to be sure that you're really taking appropriate actions to protect your PHI. Through looking at things with your risk glasses on, if you will, it will really help to prepare you to answer any questions about how you protect what you have. And then, of course, as was mentioned, the organization of documentation, which I'll talk about some more here. It's important to have a framework in which you have your documentation laid out, your policies, your procedures related to HIPAA, privacy, and security, that you have processes documented for how you do breach reporting, that you have an assigned privacy officer and security officer. They can be the same person or different people. But you have things clearly laid out in terms of how you approach not only the protection of PHI, but how you deal with someone reporting that some data was sent to someone erroneously or that some other potential breach occurred. And with all your documentation, you just want to make sure it's structured in such a way that you can easily find the information you need and present it so that you can answer questions easily. Thinking kind of in terms of lessons learned, and from this I'm talking about things I think people have learned through various audit processes. It's important to be prepared ahead of time, and again that was mentioned I think by each of the panelists. You don't want to just go into an OCR audit blind, but you want to really be prepared. Part of this is through reviewing the information that OCR provides, the protocol they have, the information that they show in terms of what they are requiring, and knowing about yourself. You need to know if you're a covered entity, a business associate, or both based on the different trading partners you work with. You want to make sure you have a clear understanding of who your customers are, who your vendors are, other trading partners you work with, who is a BA to you, who are you a BA to, making sure you have the appropriate agreements in place, that they're current with HIPAA and HITECH requirements, that they have all the required controls in place that you're requiring of your BAs, that they safeguard their data, because as was again mentioned earlier, not only should you be looking at your own risk, but the risks of your business associates. Any vendors you have, do you know how well they are safeguarding the information you've entrusted to them, not just from an agreement and point of view, but have you talked with them? Have you visited them? Do you clearly know how they protect the information that they process for you? And then you want to be prepared to be able to provide those BAs and other agreements, the business associate agreements and other agreements, to the auditors. In terms of going through the audit itself, and this is really true, I think, safe to say, of most any audit, your demeanor is important. And a lot of this, it might sound funny to even say that, but if you're fully prepared, if you understand your risks, if you've put in place the controls you need to have in place, if you're aware of where your weaknesses are, and you have a good understanding of why they're there, whether it's a cost prohibitive issue in terms of putting better controls in place, or if it's a matter of some dependency on a third party that you have no control over and that you're not able to have control over, just understanding where your risks are, where your weaknesses are, and that you have your controls and documentation in order can really help you to be more relaxed in going through an audit. It's important that you have a non-defensive attitude, you're ready to answer whatever questions are presented. Auditors, through going through a lot of audits, they can kind of pick up when someone has what that deer in the headlights look means. If you're digging into an area that they're really scared for you to be addressing, make sure you're prepared to talk about whatever might come up in relation to the audit. And again, make sure that your documentation is in order. And then make sure your staff is educated. Everybody in your company should know you're going through the audit. And really, even irrespective of the audit, everyone should be educated in HIPAA privacy and security. And you should have your annual training going on. You should have reminders in terms of posters or emails or whatever going on with your company to keep them up to date on what they should all know since they handle PHI or since they're in the vicinity of PHI. Then when the auditors come in and they sit down with someone, your staff isn't taken by surprise and they can be relaxed as well. And then I just say clean house, and that is obviously you have all these policies and procedures and you have your people trained and everything else. It doesn't hurt to still do a walkthrough of your office and make sure that everything is looking orderly and that you don't even give the perception of not being prepared. You want to make sure that you present a proper image to your auditors, not a false image, but you want to just be prepared and not have them show up and for you to have to say, oh yeah, you're coming today, and kind of scramble. You want to be nice and prepared and give a good demeanor. And by being prepared, I think you'll be very ready for whatever they throw at you. And I do believe from both sides of the table that EHNAC is an excellent way to address all of these issues. Lee?
Thank you, Ron. That was excellent to provide kind of your perspective is that of an auditor who actually goes out and performs these. And I think that's a very important kind of summary, as we've heard from all the panelists on various experiences that they've gone through, and to hear as well yours on the actual, from an EHNAC auditing perspective, on what you feel is important that people be aware of. So this has been really excellent, I think, in hearing from the overall panel. This is basically, this next slide basically says get ready for the ride. We've got, certainly there's going to be continued to be audits going on in 2013. I think the aspect of being prepared is going to be absolutely critical, and I think people have talked about some various points here. And so we're going to take a couple minutes for Q&A before we close at 3 o'clock Eastern. So and if you have any questions, please type them in as Ron has indicated at the beginning here. We'll look to get to any of your questions as time permits. Ron, do we have any questions before I go off and ask them?
Yeah, one question is whether the PowerPoint presentation will be made available.
Yes, and I was going to make the announcement that we will have on the EHNAC website, others on the panel may also include it on theirs, but on the EHNAC website within a week of prior, right after this webinar, we will be having both the presentation as well as we'll have an audio version as well of the entire presentation will be available for people to download. So if you have people that you think could benefit from seeing the presentation and or listening to the audio, we will have that available. All right?
And I have a few other questions here, Lee.
Okay, Ron.
Okay. and forgive me if I can't get to all of these. I'm trying to digest them. One of the questions was, there was a question if it can be disclosed if KPMG auditors met with the CIO, the CEO, basically the C-level members of the organization or members of the legal staff.
I think what I heard, and again, any of the panel, please jump in here, but I believe that I heard from several of the presenters who gave their experiences that they did meet with probably a combination of their executive team plus probably their legal and regulatory. Jim, any other comments? I think you were talking about the fact that some of your executive team, they met with your executive team, but I would assume that's probably some of your compliance as well.
Yeah, they met with almost our entire executive team, as well as our couple of our legal team who were remote, so they dialed in. So we had a a strong representation from our organization present at the table at both the initial interview as well as the exit interview with the KPMG auditors.
Okay, great. John, I assume kind of similar in your situation as well?
Yeah, well, I'm the CFO, and our CEO met with them as well. We're probably a thinner organization than some of the others that spoke, but yeah, they met with all three of our board members too. Great.
Doreen, I assume they met as well with your executive team, and probably I know you're the Chief Privacy Officer as well. They may have met with some other compliance people.
That's very true. We had our C-suite available, and for both the initial as well as the exit interview.
Perfect. So Ron, I think in summary, I think the answer is both at the executive level and with the legal and compliance organizations in each of these companies.
Okay. Another question, it says, can you suggest some low-cost or free resources for organizations to conduct their own internal security risk analysis? I'll just make a quick comment on this, Lee, and then turn it over to you. I know that NIST has a lot of resources available, I mean a ton of them available, and it's information that's freely available. I think there's some good tools out there that can be drawn off of. I know there's various other resources. Lee?
I think that's good, Ron. That's good advice. And also, there's a lot of great information on the website. If you go out there and do some research, I know that whether or not it's OCR has a great information, a lot of various, WEDI, the Workgroup for Electronic Data Exchange, EHNAC, is just some sites to look at for to get information. There are a number of, and if you just go out and look at security and privacy tools that are out there, there's a myriad. Probably the biggest issue that you'll find is that is such a myriad of tools that are out there. You have to really do some research on the ones that are free, as well as ones that cost money. You need to develop some requirements, determine what you're actually looking for, your objectives are, and make sure that whatever tools that you're going to look at are really going to meet those requirements, because that's probably first and foremost the most important aspect. So with that, Ron.
Lee, can I just mention one thing? This is Sharon.
Yes, Sharon.
It's important to make sure if you're going out to the internet and looking at things that you've done the analysis of are you a business associate, are you a covered entity? I've had clients who utilized free resources, but they were not applicable to their situation.
That's very good. Excellent advice. So with that, I'm going to take the opportunity to thank all of you for participating in the webinar. I want to also thank the panel for really some excellent presentations and terrific perspective and sharing your experiences. We're going to, EHNAC is going to be having another webinar series. We'll be starting in 2013. And we would invite you to check out our website at ehnac.org to see what additional sessions we'll be having in 2013. And please avail yourselves of it. And with that, let me wish all of you happy holidays, and thank you all again for your participation. And as I indicated, the Both the presentation and the audio version will be available on the EHNAC website within a week of the webinar. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the day.